The dust swirled around Eleanor's boots as the stagecoach rattled away, leaving her alone on the cracked, sun-baked earth of the Arizona territory. She clutched her carpet bag, her only tether to the life she'd left behind in Boston. At 22, she'd answered a mail-order-brought advertisement, expecting to meet a kindly rancher named Thomas Hargrove, whose letters promised a modest but loving home. But the ranch before her was not the tidy homestead described. It was a sprawling, ramshackle spread, with sagging fences and a barn that leaned like a weary old man. No one came to greet her. The wind howled, carrying the scent of sagebrush and something wilder, untamed. Her heart pounded as she scanned the horizon, realizing the driver had left her at the wrong place. She'd heard tales of the frontier of bandits, wild animals, and Apache warriors who moved like shadows. Yet, here she stood, alone, her lace gloves absurdly delicate against the rugged vastness. She whispered a prayer, her voice trembling, and took a step toward the ranch house, its windows dark and unwelcoming. As she approached, a figure emerged from the side of the barn, impossibly tall, his silhouette cutting against the fading sun. Her breath caught. He was no settler. His long black hair and buckskin clothes marked him as Apache, and his size was unlike any man she'd ever seen. She froze, her mind racing with stories of raids and violence. But then he raised a hand, palm open, and his voice, low and steady, carried across the distance, "Don't be afraid." The words were soft, almost swallowed by the wind, but they held a weight that stilled her panic. She didn't know why, but something in his tone made her believe him. She stood there, caught between fear and curiosity, as he stepped closer, his dark eyes studying her with a quiet intensity. He was not what she expected, not a savage, not a threat, but a man whose presence seemed to anchor the wildness around them. Eleanor tightened her grip on her bag, her resolve wavering but unbroken. She had come west for a new life, and though this was not the ranch she'd been promised, she sensed this moment was the beginning of something she could not yet name. The giant Apache man gestured toward the house, as if inviting her to decide her own path. She took a shaky breath, her heart still racing, and nodded, stepping forward into the unknown, trusting the whisper that had pierced her fear. 2. Eleanor's boots crunched on the gravel as she followed the Apache man toward the ranch house, her mind a tangle of doubt and determination. His name, he said, was Tarak, and his voice carried a rhythm that felt older than the land itself. He spoke English with a careful precision, as if each word was a stone placed just so. The ranch, he explained, belonged to no one now. Its owner, a man named Hargrove, had died months ago, struck down by fever. The letters Eleanor had received were old, sent before his death, and the agency had failed to correct the error. She felt a pang of betrayal, her dreams of a stable life unraveling like thread. Tarak's eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to see her disappointment, but he offered no pity, only facts. The ranch was abandoned, its cattle scattered, its fields left to the mercy of the desert. Yet he stayed here, tending what little remained, as if bound by some unspoken duty. Eleanor wondered why a man like him, tall as a mountain, with hands that could crush stone, chose to linger in a place so broken. She glanced at him, noting the scars on his arms, the way his movements were deliberate, like a wolf pacing its territory. The house creaked as they entered, its interior thick with dust and shadows. A table stood in the center, covered with a cloth that might once have been white. Tarak lit a lantern, and the dim glow revealed walls lined with faded photographs and tools rusted by time. Eleanor's throat tightened as she realized she had nowhere else to go. The stagecoach wouldn't return for days, and the nearest town was a perilous journey through Apache lands. Tarak seemed to sense her unease, his voice softening again. "You are safe here." She wanted to believe him, but the weight of her situation pressed down alone, unmarried, and stranded in a land that felt like it could swallow her whole. She set her bag down, her fingers brushing the Bible she'd packed for comfort. Tarak watched her, his silence heavy but not unkind. He offered her a chair, then moved to the hearth, building a fire with a skill that spoke of years in this harsh place. As the flames flickered, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. This man, this giant who could have been her enemy, was offering her shelter. She didn't understand his reasons, but his presence was a shield against the vast, empty night outside. She sat, her hands clasped, and asked him why he stayed. His answer was simple: "This land speaks to me." She didn't know what he meant, but the words stirred something deep within her, a longing for purpose she hadn't known she carried. 3. The fire crackled as night fell, wrapping the ranch house in a cocoon of warmth against the desert's chill. Eleanor sat at the table, sipping bitter coffee Tarak had brewed from beans he'd found in the pantry. Her eyes darted to him, standing by the window, his broad frame filling the space like a sentinel. He was watching the horizon, as if expecting something or someone. She wanted to ask about his life, about the Apache people she'd only heard of in whispered tales back east, but fear of offending him kept her silent. Instead, she spoke of Boston, her words tumbling out in a nervous rush of cobblestone streets, church bells, the crowded boarding house where she'd worked as a seamstress. Tarak listened, his face unreadable, but his occasional nods encouraged her to continue. She told him of her father's death, the debts that forced her to answer the mail order ad, the hope that had carried her across the country. Her voice wavered as she admitted her fear of this new land, its vastness so unlike the tidy world she'd known. Tarak turned from the window, his eyes catching the firelight. "Fear is a teacher," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It shows you what you must face." The words struck her, simple yet profound, and she felt a flicker of courage. He moved to a corner of the room, retrieving a woven blanket, its patterns intricate and unfamiliar. He draped it over her shoulders, and she marveled at its softness, so at odds with the harshness of this place. They talked into the night, her questions growing bolder. She asked about his people, and he spoke of the Apache while living with the land, not against it, honoring the spirits in the mountains and rivers. His words painted a world alive with meaning, where every rock and tree held a story. Eleanor felt her fear shift, not disappearing but transforming into awe. Tarak was no savage, as the newspapers claimed. He was a man of deep conviction, tied to this land in ways she couldn't yet grasp. As the fire died down, he offered her the only bed in the house, a simple cot in a small room. She protested, but he insisted, saying he preferred the floor by the hearth. Lying in the dark, the blanket around her, Eleanor thought of his words, his quiet strength. She was still afraid of the future, of this wild place, but his presence, like the blanket, was a comfort she hadn't expected. Sleep came slowly, her mind alive with the strangeness of this night, the wrong ranch, and the man who had whispered her fears away. 4. Morning broke with a blaze of gold over the desert, the light spilling through the cracked window of the ranch house. Eleanor woke to the smell of frying cornmeal, Tarak already at work over the hearth. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his large hands deft as he prepared a simple meal. She watched him, struck by how his presence filled the room, and not just his size, but the calm authority he carried. Over breakfast, he explained that the ranch was on the edge of Apache territory, a place where settlers and natives clashed over land and water. Hargrove, the man she was meant to marry, had been kind to Tarak's people, allowing them to hunt on his land, a rare act of peace in a tense frontier. That was why Tarak stayed, to honor a debt to a dead man. Eleanor listened, her fork stilled, as she realized the complexity of this world she'd entered. She asked if he was alone, and his eyes darkened. His family, he said, was gone. He lost to disease and conflict years ago. He spoke little of it, but the weight of his loss hung in the air. Eleanor felt a pang of kinship. She, too, knew grief. She offered to help with the ranch, desperate to prove she wasn't useless, though her hands were soft from city life. Tarak nodded, handing her a bucket to fetch water from a nearby creek. The task was harder than she expected, the bucket heavy, the path uneven. When she returned, sweating and breathless, Tarak's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "You are stronger than you look," he said, and she felt a flush of pride. They worked together that day, mending a fence under the relentless sun. Her muscles ached, but she refused to complain, driven by a need to earn her place. Tarak taught her to listen to the land, the hum of insects, the shift of the wind, saying it would tell her what she needed to know. She began to see the desert not as empty, but alive, its rhythm subtle but constant. By afternoon, riders appeared on the horizon, settlers from a neighboring ranch, their faces hard with suspicion. They demanded to know why an Apache was here, their hands on their rifles. Eleanor's heart raced, but Tarak stood calm, explaining his tie to Hargrove. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm, vouching for him. The settlers left, uneasy but satisfied, and Tarak looked at her with something new or respect. As the sun set, they sat outside, the stars a vast canopy above. Eleanor felt the stirrings of trust, not just in Tarak, but in herself. This wrong ranch, this unexpected man, was teaching her to stand taller than she ever had. 5 days passed, and Eleanor found a rhythm in the work of the ranch, her hands growing calloused, her fear of the desert fading. Tarak was a patient teacher, showing her how to tend the few remaining horses, how to spot edible plants among the scrub. His knowledge was vast, drawn from a life lived close to the earth, and she marveled at how he seemed to hear the land's secrets. They spoke often now, their conversations a bridge between their worlds. She shared stories of her childhood, of snowball fights and church hymns, while he told of Apache ceremonies, of dances that called the rain. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, and she found herself listening not just to his words but to the silences between them. One morning, he took her to a canyon nearby, its walls carved with the ancient symbols. He explained their meaning as stories of creation, of survival, and she felt a reverence she hadn't known since her father's sermons. But tension lingered. Word had spread of an Apache man living at Hargrove's ranch, and settlers whispered of raids, blaming Tarak's people for missing cattle. Eleanor saw the distrust in their eyes when they passed through, delivering supplies or news. She defended Tarak, her voice growing steadier with each encounter, but the settlers' warnings gnawed at her. What if they were right? What if Tarak was hiding something? One night, a gunshot cracked the silence, and Eleanor bolted upright, her heart pounding. Tarak was already at the door, his rifle in hand. He motioned for her to stay back, but she followed, clutching a kitchen knife. Outside, they found a calf, bleeding from a bullet wound, its mother lowing in distress. Tarak knelt beside it, his hands gentle as he assessed the injury. "Not Apache," he said, pointing to the clumsy shot. "This is settler work." Anger flared in Eleanor as she knew the settlers blamed Tarak's people without proof. Together, they tended the calf, saving its life under the moonlight. As they worked, she saw the pain in Tarak's eyes, the weight of being judged for who he was. She reached out, her hand brushing his, a silent promise of alliance. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw vulnerability in the giant who had seemed unbreakable. They returned to the house, exhausted but bound by the night's shared struggle. Eleanor realized she no longer saw him as an Apache or herself as a settler, just two people fighting for a place in a hard world. 6. The days grew hotter, the desert testing Eleanor's endurance, but she felt herself changing, her spirit hardening like the land. Tarak taught her to ride, her fear giving way to exhilaration as she galloped across the open plain, his steady presence beside her. She began to see the beauty in this harsh place, the way the sunrise painted the cliffs, the fleeting bloom of a cactus flower. But the settlers' distrust grew louder, their visits more frequent, their questions sharper. They spoke of an Apache band nearby, accused of stealing horses, and warned Eleanor to leave before trouble came. She refused, her loyalty to Tarak unshakable, though doubt crept in when she was alone. One afternoon, a young Apache boy appeared at the ranch, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes wide with fear. He spoke rapidly to Tarak in their language, and Eleanor saw the giant's calm falter. The boy's family was in danger, caught in a dispute with settlers over a watering hole. Tarak prepared to leave, his movements swift, his face set. Eleanor insisted on coming, ignoring his protests. They rode hard, the boy leading them to a dry riverbed where a small group of Apache families faced armed settlers. The air crackled with tension, words flying like arrows. Tarak stepped between them, his voice steady, calling for peace. Eleanor, her heart in her throat, added her voice, pleading for reason, her presence a surprise to both sides. She spoke of Tarak's honor, of the ranch they'd worked to save, and slowly, the settlers lowered their guns. The Apache families retreated, safe for now, and Tarak looked at Eleanor with a gratitude that needed no words. On the ride back, he told her of his dream to see his people and the settlers find a way to share the land. It was a fragile hope, but she clung to it, her heart swelling with purpose. That night, as they sat by the fire, she realized she no longer dreamed of Boston or the life she'd planned. This ranch, this man, this fight up, it was her life now. She reached for his hand, and he didn't pull away. The silence between them was no longer heavy but warm, filled with unspoken promises. 7 weeks turned to months, and the ranch began to heal under their care. The fences stood straighter, the horses grew strong, and Eleanor's hands were no longer those of a city girl. She and Tarak worked as partners, their days filled with shared labor and quiet moments of understanding. The settlers' visits grew less hostile, some even offering help, swayed by Eleanor's fierce defense of Tarak. But the peace was fragile, and news came of a larger conflict brewing, an Apache band clashing with a cavalry unit to the north. The ranch felt like a sanctuary, but Eleanor knew it couldn't last. One evening, a letter arrived, carried by a dusty rider. It was from the agency, apologizing for the error that sent her to the wrong ranch. They offered to arrange her passage to another settler, a new husband. Eleanor stared at the letter, her heart torn. The life she'd come west for was within reach, yet it felt like a betrayal of everything she'd built here. She showed the letter to Tarak, her voice steady as she asked what he thought. He was silent for a long time, his eyes on the fire. "You must choose your path," he said finally, his voice thick with something she couldn't name. She realized then that her feelings for him had grown beyond trust, beyond partnership. She loved him, and not the rancher she'd imagined, but this giant who whispered away her fears, who saw the land and its people with a heart as vast as the desert. She tore the letter in half, letting the pieces fall into the fire. Tarak's eyes met hers, and for the first time, he smiled, a slow, radiant thing that warmed her more than the flames. They spoke late into the night, not of the future, but of the now at the ranch, the land, the fragile peace they'd carved out. Eleanor knew the challenges at a prejudice, conflict, the harshness of the frontier, but she was no longer the frightened girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach. She was home, not because of the ranch, but because of the man beside her, whose whisper had become her strength. 8. The seasons shifted, the desert blooming briefly under a rare spring rain. Eleanor and Tarak's life on the ranch grew steadier, a quiet defiance of the tensions around them. They became a bridge between worlds, hosting Apache families and settlers alike, sharing meals and stories under the wide sky. Eleanor learned fragments of Tarak's language, her tongue stumbling over the words, his laughter a rare gift. He taught her to track, to read the stars, while she taught him to read her Bible, their evenings a blend of their pasts. The settlers began to see Tarak not as a threat but as a man of honor, and the Apache families saw Eleanor as more than a settler, a woman who stood with them. Yet the shadow of conflict lingered, the cavalry's presence growing closer. One day, a young officer arrived, offering Tarak a deal: leave the ranch for a reservation, or face trouble. Eleanor's heart sank, but Tarak stood tall, his voice firm as he refused. "This is my home," he said, and Eleanor echoed him, her hand in his. The officer left, but they knew the fight wasn't over. That night, under a sky ablaze with stars, Tarak spoke of his ancestors, of their strength in the face of loss. Eleanor shared her own dreams of a life where their children, if they had them, could know both worlds. They made no promises, for the future was uncertain, but they stood together, their bond a quiet rebellion against a divided land. The ranch, once the wrong place, was now a symbol of what could be a place where fear gave way to trust, where a whisper could change everything. As dawn broke, Eleanor looked out over the desert, her heart full. She was no longer a bride sent to the wrong ranch but a woman who had found her place, beside a man whose voice, like the land, would guide her always.